The morning of November 25, 1963, outside St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, the air was raw and the crowd was held back behind steel barricades. A black-clad widow walked behind the flag-draped casket of the President of the United States. Behind her, the brothers she had left, Robert, Edward, called Ted, the patriarch's sons in their dark overcoats, and among them, standing close, almost inside the family grouping, near Ted and near Jackie, a tall Englishman with a movie actor's jaw and a slight bow to his shoulders, the wrong shape for a mourner's posture, more the posture of a man who had learned to stand exactly where he was useful. Peter Lawford, brother-in-law, bridge, about to become invisible. That is the photograph. That is the man in it. Within a few years, he will be gone from this family story, not by way of a quiet divorce, but by way of erasure. When he dies, 21 years later, almost none of them will come. There will be a fight, in the open, over who pays for his funeral. His ashes will not stay in the ground. So what happened between the photograph and Christmas Eve of 1984? 4 things, mostly. He married into this family over the patriarch's objection and changed his religion to do it. He became the single most valuable line between the Kennedys and Hollywood. He was made to deliver a message on a single weekend in 1962 that destroyed the friendship his whole life was built on, for a decision he had no part in. And on the last night of Marilyn Monroe's life, he was one of the last voices she heard on the telephone. Almost none of those outcomes were things Peter Lawford chose. They are things that happened to him, inside a family that has never been a family in the ordinary sense, that has always been an enterprise with an objective, and that measures people by what they add to the enterprise, and quietly removes them when the balance changes. So, who was he before any of that? Peter Sidney Ernest Lawford was born in London on September 7, 1923. His father was Sir Sidney Lawford, a decorated British Army general, a knight of the realm, a serious soldier who had earned his rank the slow way. His mother was May, who would become Lady Lawford. That is the line on the birth certificate. The line behind the line is less tidy. At the moment Peter was conceived, his mother and father were married, but not to each other. Each was married to someone else. 2 prior divorces had to be arranged and finalized, and a third marriage conducted before his arrival was made respectable on paper. Children of that arrangement grow up understanding, at some early age they cannot quite date, that the world has a front room for guests and a back staircase for the truth. Peter's mother, by every account that survives, was difficult and wounding. A snob, in the small English way that is also a weapon. She is reported to have said cruel things about her son in front of other people. She is also the reason he learned to perform charm before he learned to read a room. His childhood had no fixed address. The family moved through Europe. He was educated by tutors instead of schools. He spent more time with adults than with children, in the way that only children of older parents, of divorced older parents, of socially ambitious mothers do. The result, visible later in every photograph of the adult man, was a particular kind of polish. He was charming. He was socially fluid. He was comfortable anywhere. He belonged nowhere. And at 14, he put his arm through a glass door. The accident was exactly the kind of stupid, quiet, domestic catastrophe that ruins a life without anyone else in the house ever quite noticing. He was in his own home. He went through a pain, or against one. The nerves were damaged. The arm was permanently weakened, partially crippled. He would carry the injury into every photograph of him as an adult, into every handshake, into every film in which he had to lift a glass, fire a pistol, hold a woman, because as a young man in wartime England, his right arm had quietly stopped being trustworthy. For the son of a knighted general in the early years of the Second World War, this was a private humiliation of a very specific shape. He could not serve. He could not do the one thing his father's class, his father's name, his father's country required of a young man in 1939. A door made of glass had for him closed the field of honor. And so the template set. He could not be a soldier. He could not be the man of substance and duty his father was. He could, instead, be the man a room wanted in it. If you cannot earn a place by what you have done, you learn to earn it by being wanted there. That is the survival strategy of the boy he had been, and it is the survival strategy of the man he becomes. It will carry him beautifully into the most famous family in America. It will also leave him with no fortress of his own to retreat into when the goodwill is withdrawn. In a year or two, he will cross the Atlantic for Hollywood. He will sign with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the biggest of the studios, and they will do what studios do with a handsome English boy who knows how to be liked. They will cast him. Accent, jaw, manners, the slight damage in the arm that no audience ever sees, but every coach of his will compensate for. He will make a long, steady career rather than a great one, the dependable leading man at the edge of the frame, the pal, the brother, the decent chap. He will be the man you put next to the star, never the man you put in the close-up that wins the prize. He will be, in other words, exactly what the Kennedys later need him to be: ornament, instrument, connector. The kind of man Hollywood does not especially remember, and the kind of man Washington can use. But that is ahead. Here for now is the man in the photograph. London, 1923. Eldest son of a decorated officer and a difficult woman whose marriage to the officer was a rearrangement rather than a beginning. A childhood spent in hotels and other people's houses, with no school he could call his own, and no friends his own age, he saw often enough to keep. A glass door, in his own home, in his 14th year, and an arm that did not heal properly, and a war he could not fight. A boy taught, by every circumstance of his upbringing, that belonging is conditional, and that conditional belonging is better than no belonging at all. Stand that boy outside a cathedral in Washington, 20 years later, in a black overcoat, in a circle of people who are not his by blood and have never quite been his by right. He is inside the frame. He is useful. He is wanted in the room. The bride in black will smile at him on her way past the coffin. The brothers will nod. The patriarch is dead by then, so the patriarch's objections are no longer operative. And then the camera will move on, and the frame will close, and almost everything he has built his adult life on will begin, quietly, to come apart. A studio in the late 1940s is not a place for self-discovery. It is a place for the rapid assembly of a product. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer looked at Peter Lawford, 20-something, very handsome, English accent intact, the bruise of class showing through every line of him, and saw the use before he did. He could be the gentleman, the officer, the decent young man in the dinner jacket standing one step behind the comic. Not a great actor and not pretending to be one, but so likable you wanted him at the table, on the screen, in the photograph at the wrap party. He was, by the verdict of almost every contemporary who ever wrote about him, the man who made a room easier. That is the limit of the talent, and it is also the whole of the talent. Studio audiences could be relied on to feel mildly good when he walked into the frame, and the studio was happy with mildly good, and he was happy with being relied on, and that was the agreement, and it held for years. He built a life on being liked. It is the one sentence that contains both his rise and his ruin, because the model works brilliantly until the people in charge stop liking you, and when they stop, you have nothing else in the drawer. He didn't see that yet. Nobody does, when the work is going. And then, in the early 1950s, he met Patricia Kennedy. She was the sixth of the 9 Kennedy children. She was tall, quiet, sophisticated, with the family's sharp bones and a slightly more private manner than some of her brothers and sisters, which, in that family, is itself a kind of distinction. She had wanted, by accounts that survive, to work in film production herself. She knew what a movie studio was, she knew what actors were. They ran in the same overlapping circles of the East Coast Catholic upper class for a while before it became serious. She knew who he was before he knew what she was. Her father was Joseph P. Kennedy. To understand the marriage that is about to take place, you have to understand Joe Kennedy first, and you have to understand him not as a patriarch of a warm clan, but as the chief executive of a project that happens to be carried out by blood relations. Joe Kennedy had decided, very early, that his children would be instruments of a specific kind of success, political power eventually, but at the foundation, financial power, social reach, and a refusal to be embarrassed by anyone in the family. Every marriage in the family was, at some level, assessed for what it added to the project. Daughters' husbands were expected to be assets. Sons' wives were expected to be assets. A marriage that was merely romantic, that brought no campaign operatives, no investors, no allies, no useful enemies, a marriage that was merely romantic was, to this particular father, a kind of small failure. Look at the comparator marriages inside the family, and the logic becomes legible. Eunice Kennedy married Sergeant Shriver, a serious Catholic, a real political mind, the man who would later build the Peace Corps and run for vice president on a national ticket. That is a marriage that adds an entire wing to the building. Jean Kennedy married Stephen Smith, who would run much of the family's money and the logistical machinery of its campaigns. That is a marriage that builds the basement and keeps the lights on. Those husbands earned permanent places inside the machine because the machine, having eaten what they brought, did not wish to spit them out. What did Peter Lawford bring? Glamour. Only glamour. Glamour can evaporate overnight. Glamour has no campaign operation, no Rolodex of Catholic donors, no instinct for the way the family calculates. Joe Kennedy, it should be said, knew Hollywood better than almost any other father in America. He had made a fortune there himself in the late 1920s and early 30s, before being eased out of the studio system by people who decided an Irish Catholic ought not to be running their pictures. He knew what actors were. He knew exactly what they were. 3 objections, on record, and likely more in private. He did not want his daughter marrying an actor. He did not want her marrying a British subject who would bring nothing useful to an American political dynasty. He did not want her marrying a non-Catholic. There is also a line attributed to Joe Kennedy that may be embellished, but that lands true to the man, that he would rather his daughter married almost anyone than an actor. Put the 3 objections together, and you can hear the structure of the refusal: an actor, a foreigner, a heretic, in a dynasty run by an Irish Catholic who knows exactly what each of those things is worth. The marriage was not in the design. Patricia insisted. There is no record of Patricia Kennedy being a woman who lost arguments easily, and there is the additional force here that she was a grown adult, and her father, however formidable, did not have jurisdiction over her. Lawford did what any man with no leverage does when the woman he wants is the daughter of a man who has just named the price of admission. He paid it. He converted to Catholicism. The religious objection, the only one that could be settled at the altar rather than at the desk, was settled. And on April 24, 1954, at the Church of St. Thomas More in Manhattan, Peter Lawford married Patricia Kennedy. Outside, thousands of onlookers pressed against police barricades for a sight of the bride and the bride's brothers and the bride's father and the man the bride had chosen. It looked, from the curb, like the warmest sort of acceptance. It was, in fact, an acceptance on probation. He had married in over the patriarch's objection. He had changed his religion to qualify. He had been allowed in because his wife insisted, and in a family of this kind, that is a place with a footnote attached. It is not the foundation of a secure membership. It is the foundation of a permanent suspicion. And Lawford would spend the next decade building the rest of the structure. The right friends, the right rooms, the right photo opportunities at the right moments to put that footnote out of sight. He would almost succeed. He would in fact succeed so well that by the early 1960s he would be, by any external measure, the most enviable outsider in America. He would be the brother-in-law of the President of the United States. He would host that president at his beach house. He would stand at state dinners next to senators. He would sleep through a long career in Hollywood that becomes, in those years, indistinguishable from a career in politics, none of which would change the footnote. He was in. He was wanted in the room. That is not the same as belonging in a family that has never quite forgotten the year it let him in and the conditions under which it did. A man on probation does not get to relax. A man on probation watches. A man on probation knows that the door is the kind of door it is, and that the people on the other side have the keys. He did not quite know it, not yet. He thought he had been adopted. He thought the wedding had been the initiation, and what came after the wedding was the life. He was wrong about that, and the proof would come in a single weekend 2 years into Jack Kennedy's presidency, on a sun-blasted lawn in the California desert. But that too is ahead. For now, in the spring of 1954, a man who had learned as a boy to make himself useful in order to be permitted to remain has just been permitted into the most ambitious household on the eastern seaboard. He had paid in advance the only price the patriarch would accept. The photograph on the steps of the church will be filed away under wedding, not under sacrament. The thousands behind the barricades will go home. The bride will go off on a honeymoon. And somewhere in the family compound, A man in his 60s with a fortune and a plan and a very long memory has just allowed a movie actor to take his daughter out the door and is not at all sure it was the right call. He was right not to be sure. The years after the wedding were the bridge years. That is the cleanest word for them, and it has two sides. A bridge connects two things that would otherwise not reach each other. A bridge has no value of its own. A bridge is useful while the two sides still want to cross. The second the two sides do not, the bridge is just an obstacle in the water, and someone, eventually, builds another way around. On one side, the Kennedys, ascending, senator, candidate, president, a family becoming, by the end of the 50s, the embodiment of American political ambition in the 20th century. On the other side, Hollywood, specifically Frank Sinatra and the loose group of friends and performers the press had taken to calling the Rat Pack. Sinatra was, by 1958 or so, a passionate Kennedy supporter. He raised money. He opened his house. He said the right things in interviews and the wrong things in nightclub booths, in the way Sinatra always had. He wanted in. He wanted a Kennedy in the White House. He wanted his own phone call returned. He did not have a phone call. He did not have a number that connected to Hyannisport. He had, instead, Peter Lawford. Sinatra's nickname for him, affectionate and exact, was Brother in Lawford, brother-in-law plus Lawford, a pun, a label, and a small joke that contained a description of what Peter actually was to Frank: the access point, the door, the man you called to get to the family. Through Lawford, two streams flowed. Hollywood money and Hollywood star power moved toward the Kennedy campaign. Stars appeared at fundraisers. Stars appeared at dinners. Rooms full of people who had never voted before, who had never been asked before, filled with the charge of being needed by the most exciting family in America. And the other direction, the thrilling proximity to a future president, moved toward Sinatra and his circle. The sense that the singer was not merely a singer, that he moved in the same current as senators now, that kings of whatever he had been were beginning to sit at tables of state. The Kennedys understood the value of celebrity before almost anyone else in American politics did. They understood it as a tool, and they used it as a tool. Lawford was their instrument for harnessing it. He could put a candidate in a room with a singer. He could put a singer in a room with a candidate. He could take a phone call at midnight from a man running for president, and then take a phone call at noon from a man who wanted to sing at the next fundraiser, and he could make both calls feel as if the same kind of trust was at stake in each. After the win, in the late months of 1960 and into 1961, the position reached its peak. Lawford's house on the beach in Santa Monica, on the Pacific, became a place the president stayed when he came to California. It was called, in the press, the Western White House. There is a particular photograph of that period, of a thin young president in shirt sleeves walking on a beach with a tall, smiling Englishman a step behind, that captures the whole arrangement in a single frame. The President of the United States taking the air, the brother-in-law carrying the rest. And so Lawford stood inside both worlds at once, and the world stood on either side of him. He could pick up a telephone in his house in Santa Monica and reach the President of the United States, his wife's brother. He could pick up the same telephone and reach Frank Sinatra. Senators and movie stars passed through his hallway. He hosted the leader of the free world in his living room by the sea, and then, the next night, hosted the most powerful entertainer in America at the same table. He was, for a couple of extraordinary years, the hinge. He was necessary to both. The intoxication of that is hard to overstate, and it is also the exact point at which to begin to worry about him, because the man who does not understand the structure of his own position is the first man the structure will discard when it shifts. Lawford, by every surviving account, did not understand that he was a bridge. He understood, instead, that he was a member. He believed the wedding photograph had been the initiation, and the late-night calls had been the confirmation, and the years at the center had been the natural result. He believed, in other words, that belonging. The Kennedys understood precisely what he was. They understood it the way engineers understand a bridge. They knew what he carried between which two places. They knew he was not load-bearing in either place on his own. They knew what he was worth when Sinatra wanted to reach the family. They knew what he was worth when Hollywood needed to be reminded that the family was still glamorous. They knew exactly how to use him. The danger in that, for him, is that the same engineering precision that knows how to use a man knows how to stop using him. The moment Sinatra no longer needs a number into the family, the number is just a man. The moment the family no longer needs a way to reach Hollywood, the way is just a man. A bridge does not get a vote on whether the two shores still want to reach each other. A bridge gets decommissioned. He did not see any of that. He was, by the early 1960s, at the most desirable seat in 2 rooms at once, and he thought it would hold. He was at his beach house, in his shirt sleeves, in his photograph with the President of the United States, and he thought it would hold. He was Frank Sinatra's brother in Lawford and the President's brother-in-law, and he thought it would hold. Within 12 months of that peak, both shores would, in their different ways, withdraw. The bridge would still be standing. Neither side would be sending traffic across it anymore. That is the hinge of the film. What happens to a man who thought he was a member when the people who built the structure around him quietly decide he is a piece of equipment that has served its purpose? And the small final cruelty is this. The Kennedys, in their quiet way, do not appear to have resented him for not understanding. They appear to have expected it. A family that calculates as relentlessly as this one does knows that the man who is most useful is, almost always, the man who is most mistaken about why he is being kept on. They had built a household ornament out of an English boy whose own father had not married his mother when he was born, and they had installed him at the center of 2 worlds, and they were under no illusion that he would see the shape of what they had done. They expected delight. They got it. A year later, they would make a decision, a small political decision, and ask him to deliver the news. They would burn his friendship with the man who had given him that nickname to protect their own position. They would do it with the same absence of drama with which they had used him. He would not, even then, understand that it was the end. He would go on believing, for a few more years, that the door was still open, but the door had been built, all along, to swing on hinges he did not own. The weekend in question was March of 1962, a single weekend. The President of the United States was planning a trip to Southern California. Peter Lawford, doing exactly the job he had been kept on to do, arranged for the President to stay at Frank Sinatra's compound in Palm Springs. For Sinatra, this was the summit of a private lifetime. The President of the United States, his friend, sleeping under his roof. Sinatra had spent freely to prepare. He had a helicopter pad built so the President could land on the property. He built accommodations for the Secret Service. By some accounts, a flagpole for the presidential flag went up. Parts of the house were remodeled. He threw himself into the preparations the way he threw himself into everything that mattered to him, which is to say, completely, with the manic focus of a man who had clawed his way up out of an Italian-American neighborhood in Hoboken, and who now needed the world to understand that his roof was fit for a king. He wanted this. He had worked toward this. He had earned, in his own accounting, this one weekend. And then Robert Kennedy killed it. Bobby was the Attorney General. He was running the most aggressive campaign against organized crime in American history. The mob was, in the public rhetoric of his office, public enemy number 1. And Frank Sinatra had a documented, decades-long friendship with figures in organized crime, most pointedly with Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago outfit. There is no serious argument about the friendship. It existed, it was known, it had been known for years. For the President of the United States to sleep under Sinatra's roof while his own brother, as Attorney General, was prosecuting the man's friends in the courts of the United States was, in the Bobby Kennedy formulation, politically and possibly legally impossible. Worse than impossible, embarrassing. The kind of picture you cannot recover from. Bobby saw it immediately. The decision was made within the family, at speed, with the quiet efficiency the Kennedys brought to every calculation that mattered. The President would not stay with Sinatra. The President would, instead, stay with Bing Crosby. In the small additional cruelty that seems to have been accidental rather than designed, the family did not go out of its way, as a rule, to add insult to injury. It simply did not bother to subtract it. Bing Crosby was a Republican, a famous one. The man who would replace Sinatra in the presidential bet of the weekend was, in fact, on the other side of the line the Kennedys had spent their entire campaign drawing. And someone had to tell Sinatra. The family did not send Jack. The president does not make the calls the Kennedys prefer to keep off the record. The family did not send Bobby, who had made the decision and who would have been the honest messenger and who was therefore the messenger who would have left fingerprints. They sent Peter Lawford. Peter, the brother-in-law, the access point, the door. Peter, who had organized the weekend in the first place, who had confirmed the arrangements, who had shaken Sinatra's hand about it. Peter, who was, in this family, the man designated to deliver the version of the news that the family did not wish to deliver itself. Stand back for a moment from who Lawford is and look at the structure of what was done to him. The decision was made by the Kennedys. The decision was made for Kennedy reasons. The decision was made to protect Kennedy interests, and the person dispatched to absorb the consequence was the one with the least institutional power and the most personal exposure. That is not, by any definition of the word, an accident. It may not have been a cruelty consciously designed. It may have been the path of least resistance through a busy weekend, with Bobby in a hurry and Jack unwilling to call, and Peter already on the telephone. Peter already available. Peter already the man who had been used for exactly these errands for 10 years. But whether it was designed or whether it was simply the most efficient available arrangement, the effect on Peter Lawford was the same. He was made the messenger of a decision he had no part in. He was sent to pay for it. Sinatra's reaction, by every account that has come down through the people who were in the room or close to it, was volcanic. There is a story that he took a sledgehammer to the helipad he had built. The story has the right shape, a man in a rage, in his own backyard, looking at the concrete pad that no airplane would land on now, and bringing the heaviest tool in the garage to it. Other accounts say he tore up photographs. The exact inventory of damage is less important than the verdict on what was broken. The friendship of 20 years between Frank Sinatra and Peter Lawford, the friendship that had put Lawford in the center of Hollywood, that had given him his nickname, that had made him the Western White House host, that friendship ended on this lawn, on this weekend, in March of 1962. Sinatra cut him dead. He did not speak to him again, in any meaningful way, for the rest of their lives. That is not a figure of speech. That is the record. Sinatra removed Lawford from the next Rat Pack film, Robin and the Seven Hoods, which was already in pre-production. In deliberate, performative humiliation, he replaced him with Bing Crosby, the very man who had been handed the honor Sinatra had been told he was losing. The world was invited to read the message. The world read it. Years later, by accounts that have come down, Lawford tried to attend a Sinatra performance in Las Vegas, hoping to make peace. Sinatra, by those accounts, refused to go on stage until Lawford had been physically escorted out of the room. If true, it is the cruelty of a man who had decided and did not intend to be moved. If untrue, it is exactly the story that people who knew both men believed was the kind of thing Sinatra would do, which is also a kind of cruelty. And consider what this did to Peter Lawford's working life. His career in Hollywood was not built on a talent that could survive alone. It was built on access. It was built on being one of the boys, on being in the room, on being the man Sinatra called when Sinatra needed a screen partner, or a fundraiser host, or a fourth at the dinner. Sinatra was the center of that circle, and the circle did not exist without him. When Sinatra expelled Peter from the circle publicly, he did not simply fall out with a friend. He fell out of Hollywood. The meaning was instant, because Hollywood, more than any other industry in America, knows how to read the message when the most powerful man in a room publicly destroys a man who has been at his side for 20 years. There is no recovery from that kind of message in that kind of place. In a single weekend, Peter Lawford went from being the man at the center of Hollywood's most powerful clique to being a man the most powerful man in that clique had publicly unmade. And the unmaking had been done by his own family, in his own family's interest, in his own family's defense. Bobby made the call. Jack accepted it. Peter paid for it. The blow that ruined him came from the people who had, in 1954, opened the door to him. They did not have to pick up a hammer themselves. They only had to point him at the man who would. That is the hinge of the story. It is, on the evidence, the worst thing the Kennedys did to him that he did not, in some sense, do to himself. He had no vote. He had no chance to argue. He was the messenger. The rest of his life in that family is, from this weekend forward, a long, quiet receipt for that one errand. He did not see it as that, not yet. He believed, in the immediate aftermath, that the family would balance the books. He believed that having bled for them, he would be repaid. He had not yet understood that a family that calculates this precisely does not pay its messengers out of gratitude. It uses them again. And when the moment comes that the messenger has cost the family more than he has saved, the messenger is not repaid. The messenger is retired. He still, in March of 1962, believed the door would reopen. He still believed he was a member. What he had become, in fact, was a man with a presentable wound that he was not allowed to discuss, in a family that had decided to keep its hands clean of the knife. 5 months later, in August of 1962, another association attached itself to Peter Lawford that would follow him into his grave. This one is harder to talk about cleanly. 60 years of books and movies and television documentaries have grown an enormous structure of speculation around the events of August 4th, 1962, the night Marilyn Monroe died. And the structure has long since taken on a life of its own. So before anything else is said about that night, the film's own method has to be stated out loud, here, on the record. What is documented and what is only rumored are not the same kind of thing. A careful documentary keeps them separated. It says which is which every time. It refuses to assert what cannot be established, and it refuses to mock what is established as if it were merely rumor. The Marilyn Monroe night is the hardest passage in this story, and it is going to be handled with the only honesty the record permits, which is to name what is known, to name what is only claimed, to name who said it and what they had to gain, and to refuse to deliver a verdict the evidence does not support. What is genuinely established? Peter Lawford knew Marilyn Monroe. She had been a guest at his beach house in Santa Monica. He moved in the social space where the private lives of the Kennedys and Hollywood overlapped, and he functioned in that space the way he functioned in every space, as facilitator, as host, as connector. He is the man who arranged for Monroe to perform at the famous birthday celebration for the president at Madison Square Garden in May of 1962. He put her on that stage. He put her in that dress. He is the man who heard her sing Happy Birthday to the President of the United States in a voice that welded her, permanently, into the Kennedy legend, in the public mind. That part of his life is not in dispute. The documented and genuinely haunting part is this. On the night Marilyn Monroe died, Peter Lawford was one of the last people to speak to her on the telephone. He telephoned her, by his own later account, and the source warning on Lawford's own later account is going to be explained in a moment, to invite her to dinner. What he heard on the line alarmed him. Her voice, in his recollection, was faint, slurred, fading. He says she said something to the effect of, "Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to the president, and say goodbye to yourself, because you are a nice guy." Then the line went quiet. That is Lawford's own recollection, given in interviews conducted, in some cases, 20 years after the fact. What Lawford did and did not do in the hours after that telephone call has been debated ever since. He says he was alarmed. He says he wanted to go to her house. By several of the accounts in circulation, he was talked out of going directly himself. There are claims that he, or people close to him, went to the house before the death was made public. Around all of this has grown the conspiracy architecture that anyone who has read the literature knows, claims that Lawford cleaned the scene, that he removed a diary, that he destroyed evidence, that he was acting in the hours after the call to protect the Kennedys from some imagined exposure. Some of these claims have been repeated thousands of times. None of them has ever been proven. Official investigations, including a review conducted 2 decades after the death, did not overturn the finding that Marilyn Monroe died of an overdose. That is the medical conclusion. It is also the conclusion that the conspiracy literature has never quite been able to forgive. Now, the source discipline on the lurid versions, because this part matters. A great deal of the most detailed material in the books and documentaries that fill the space around this subject traces back to unreliable sources. Some of it traces back to people writing books for money, and the books are written in a way that reflects the commercial logic of the market they were published in. Some of it traces back to Lawford himself in the last years of his life, when he was ill, when he was broke, when he was selling his memories to anyone who would pay, and when his recollections, by the account even of people who loved him, had become unreliable in ways that mattered. Some of it traces back to his last wife, in a later collaboration with an author whose commercial interest in the story was not in doubt. None of that automatically means the stories are untrue. It means the stories cannot be presented as established fact. They are claim. They are rumor. They are evidence with fingerprints on it. The film is going to do what a careful documentary does. It will not assert a cover-up. It will not assert who was where. It will not imply a killing. If a viewer arrived wanting a verdict, the honest answer is that the record does not give one. The record gives a phone call, and a frightened voice, and a line that went quiet, and then 60 years of argument. But for the story of Peter Lawford, what is true or false about the conspiracy almost does not matter. What matters is the position he was in after that night. He was publicly, permanently attached to the death of Marilyn Monroe. He was the last man she spoke to. He was tangled, fairly or not, in the swirl of rumor that connected her death to the Kennedys. And in a family built on the management of its own image, that made him something more dangerous than a fading actor. It made him radioactive. Consider, finally, the human dimension of what is established, because the man matters here as much as the symbol. By multiple accounts, Lawford was genuinely wounded by Monroe's death. People close to him later said he blamed himself, not for any crime, not for any cover-up, but for the ordinary, smaller failure, for not going to her that night, for being talked out of it, for not doing more. Whatever else is true or is not true about what happened at her house, there is a human failure here that does not need a conspiracy to wound a man. He had heard her voice fade on the telephone, he had heard her say goodbye, and he had not gone. The funeral detail completes the rhyme of his life with hers in an image that does not require any theory to make its point. Joe DiMaggio, Monroe's grieving ex-husband, arranged her burial, and he banned the Hollywood crowd, banned the Kennedys, banned the Rat Pack, banned Peter Lawford. Peter, who had genuinely cared for her, who had put her on the stage at Madison Square Garden, who had heard her voice go quiet on the last night of her life, was not permitted to say goodbye at the grave. He was hurt by it. He said so. He would say so, in interviews, for the rest of his own life. Consider for a moment the picture of him standing outside the cemetery in Los Angeles on the day of the funeral, kept away from the service, kept away from the woman he had, by his own account, tried to reach on the night she died. He was a man who cared. He was a man, in the common sense of the word, with a decent heart. He was kept out of the room because the room did not, in the end, want him in it. The rhyme between Lawford barred from Monroe's funeral and the door that the Kennedys were, slowly, beginning to close on him, is the rhyme of a man finding out what he is to the people who have used him. A piece of equipment that has, in their private accounting, begun to cost more than it returns. By the end of 1962, the arithmetic of his position inside the family had completed its turn. He had lost his usefulness because Frank Sinatra had publicly expelled him from the circle that gave his Hollywood life its shape. He had acquired a danger because Marilyn Monroe had died with his voice in her ear. He was no longer an asset. He had become a risk. And in a family that measures every human being by exactly those two categories, that is the combination from which the door quietly closes. A year later, in Dallas, the door would close the rest of the way. But the work of closing had, by August of 1962, already been done. Lawford held on a little longer because Jack was still alive and still president. As long as a Kennedy sat in the White House, the marriage to Patricia still had a structural reason to exist. He was still, technically, the president's brother-in-law. He was still the man who could put a collar through. He was still standing in the photograph outside St. Matthew's Cathedral 3 weeks after the fact, in his black overcoat, looking as if he belonged. Then November 22nd, 1963, Dallas. And the last thing holding him in place was removed. More than a president died in Dallas. An entire architecture of usefulness for Peter Lawford fell down. The White House was gone. Access meant nothing. The bridge he had been led to believe was a career had suddenly no traffic in either direction. The Kennedys were now a wounded family in mourning, not the family that had turned a beach house in Santa Monica into the Western White House. He had nothing left to offer them that they could not, in their grief, do without. And what he had to offer them before, in the long arc from 1954 onward, was already not much. A serious and worsening drinking problem. A wrecked Hollywood career, wrecked by Sinatra's public expulsion and never rebuilt. a permanent poisonous history with the most powerful entertainer in America. A radioactive association with the death of Marilyn Monroe, attached to him by fact or by rumor in a way that could not be detached by any argument he could make or by any silence he could keep. Nothing left to keep. The marriage, which had been for 10 years the only thing binding him formally to the family, began its final collapse. The drinking, which had been heavy for some time, grew worse and pulled other substances with it. Patricia had watched her mother, Rose Kennedy, endure decades of a difficult marriage in silence, as Catholic doctrine demanded, and she had reached, by the middle 1960s, the limit of what she was willing to endure. She and Peter separated. The divorce was finalized in 1966. The divorce was his formal severance from the Kennedy family, but the banishment was already well underway. The divorce made official what had been quietly building since the Palm Springs weekend of March 1962. It cut the last thread. Patricia took their 4 children to New York and rebuilt her life. Peter was left on the far side of the water. The door closed. Once closed, it stayed closed. Stop here and pull the 4 threads together because this is the argument the evidence supports and because the evidence is consistent across all of them. The first thread. He was never truly one of them to begin with. He had been admitted on probation over the patriarch's objection on 3 named grounds. He was an actor. He was a foreigner. He was, until he converted at the altar, a non-Catholic. The conversion settled the cheapest of the objections. The other 2 remained. A man admitted on probation into a family that has never been a family in the ordinary sense, a family that is, in truth, a project, has no deep roots in the structure to protect him when the structure changes its mind. He was allowed in, which is different from belonging, and he had been allowed in on conditions. The second thread. His entire value was as a bridge. Bridges are valuable only while both shores still want to reach each other. In his case, one shore was the Kennedys in Washington, the other shore was Sinatra and Hollywood. When Sinatra turned on him in March of 1962, one shore fell away. When Dallas removed the president in November of 1963, the other shore fell away. He became a bridge to nowhere, and a bridge to nowhere in any engineering gets abandoned. The third thread. The Sinatra catastrophe was the cruelest of the 4, and it was also the one most clearly the work of his own family. The decision that broke his friendship with Sinatra was a Kennedy decision, made to protect Kennedy interests, on a weekend he had merely organized. The person chosen to deliver the news was Lawford. They spent his relationship with Sinatra to insulate themselves. Having spent it, they had less reason to keep him close. The blow came from inside the house. He paid for it, completely and permanently, on their behalf. There is no serious argument against this thread. It is on the record, in the survivor accounts, and the family did not contest it then and has not contested it since. The fourth thread, the darkest. Marilyn Monroe. Whatever happened at her house on the night of August 4th, 1962, and the honest answer is that the record does not tell us, and that a careful documentary refuses to fill in the blank, the association alone made him dangerous to the family. He was the last man she spoke to on the telephone. He was named on the front of 100 paperbacks and in 100 documentaries in connection with her death. Whether or not he had anything to conceal, he was believed by the reading public to have something to conceal, and a family built on the management of its own image keeps deliberate, permanent distance from a man believed to know too much. Put the 4 threads together and the shape becomes clear. This was not a man who drifted away after a divorce. This was a man who was systematically removed. And the method of removal, which is the specific cruelty of this kind of family, was never a confrontation. There was no dramatic scene, there was no letter, no declaration. The removal was accomplished through absence, phone calls not returned, invitations that stopped arriving, a name that stopped being mentioned, in the family correspondence and in the family conversation, as if by a quiet mutual agreement, a door walled over without anyone picking up a hammer. Open cruelty can be argued with. You cannot argue with an absence. You cannot demand to be let back into a room everyone politely pretends was never yours. That is the kind of power the Kennedys had over him, and the kind of power they used. The long confirmation of the exile is visible in his career. Television guest spots, small parts, cameos, game shows. He married 3 more times after Patricia, each marriage shorter and sadder than the last, and each one a little further from the world he had been at the center of. His health collapsed under decades of alcohol and drug use. In his final years, he was broke and ill, and he sold his stories. He gave interviews about the Kennedys and about Maryland that grew, year by year, more lurid in proportion to the desperation. This is precisely why the material he produced in those years is unreliable as historical evidence. It is also precisely why the material is sad. He was cashing in the only currency the family had left him: proximity to their secrets. He had nothing else to sell. One small detail from those wilderness years worth pausing on because it tells you something that the rest of the story obscures. When one of Frank Sinatra's own family members was in serious trouble, in a genuine emergency, Sinatra, who had, on the record, sworn never to speak to Lawford again, reportedly reached out to Peter anyway. Because in a real crisis, Peter was still the man you called. Peter was reliable. Peter was decent in the way that matters when the situation is real. Even the man who had destroyed him knew, somewhere underneath the rage, that Lawford was fundamentally the person you reached for when something had to be done. The tragedy is that this knowledge never translated into rescue. People used him, and dropped him, and used him again, and the pattern held to the end. He died on December 24, 1984, Christmas Eve, Los Angeles. He was 61. His liver and kidneys, ruined by decades of substance abuse, had finally failed. He died largely estranged from the two glittering worlds he had once, in a single bright period, connected. The final indignities are a matter of record. The funeral expenses were not settled. His last wife would later state in public that his own children, his 4 children by Patricia Kennedy, the grandchildren of Joseph P. Kennedy, would not pay them. Whatever the private truth of that statement, the public outcome is on the tape. Some years after his burial at Westwood Village Memorial Park, the cemetery where Marilyn Monroe herself is buried, which is an accident of cemetery geography that the story did not need but was, apparently, given anyway, the plot was not paid for, and his remains were removed. His ashes were scattered at sea off the coast of California. Start in the most famous photograph in 20th century America, Inside the Family, one of the Kennedys. End as ashes on the water, unable to remain even in your own grave. That is the arc. And the argument the evidence supports, stated plainly, without sneering and without sentiment. Lawford's real crime was not any single thing he did. His real crime was that he stopped being useful and started being dangerous to a family that measures every human being by exactly those two things. He was useful, he was then not. The machinery that had drawn him in simply reversed. There is a counter-argument, and it should be given its honest space. Lawford's own addictions and unreliability were real. He drank too much. He used too much. He missed obligations. He told stories about himself in interviews that embarrassed the family in ways that were not invented by the family. The Kennedys did not invent the problems. They used them in the way that careful families use the real flaws of people they have decided to discard as the public reason offered later when an explanation is demanded. The truth is colder and less satisfying. He was a mirror. He reflected back what was around him, glamour when there was glamour, power when there was power. Irresistible in the early Kennedy years because he was reflecting something the family wanted reflected, and disposable in the late years because the reflection had begun to show the mob ties, the dead actress, the ugliness underneath the Camelot image. A mirror is useful only as long as the family likes what it shows. The instant it starts to show what the family would rather not see, the family turns the mirror to the wall. That is what they did to Peter Lawford, quietly, without a scene, without a letter, without even the courtesy of a conversation. The same hand that had welcomed him at St. Thomas More in 1954 had, by the end, decided that he was not worth the cost of keeping. And so the bridge, at last, was taken down.